Hello and welcome to Business Standard Views of the Week. Here is a glimpse of what appeared on the web pages of Business Standard this week. On Friday, the Reserve Bank of India announced its bi-monthly monetary policy and decided to keep the policy rates unchanged. There is no surprise in the script of Friday's no action policy of the RBI, writes Tamal Bandyopadhyay in Business Standard. On the face of it, the ultra-loose monetary policy, despite rising inflation and green shoots of recovery, may sound a bit puzzling, he writes, but globally, all central banks have been doing so. The RBI does not want to rock the boat and is buying more time for growth. The farmers' blockade of Delhi is a huge challenge to the Narendra Modi government. The blockade presents a dilemma for Narendra Modi, which will write the course of India's political economy, even electoral politics in years to come, writes Shekhar Gupta. PM Modi can either decide to double down on his government's decision and resist pressure like Margaret Thatcher, or he can concede to the farmers' demands, like Manmohan Singh government did to the Anna Hazare-led movement against corruption, posits Mr. Gupta. You can't evict them and you can't let them hang on. Even a part surrender will finish the PM's authority, he writes. The problems that farmers face have more to do with incomes than prices, writes T.N. Nainan in his weekly column in Business Standard. And the solution lies not on the farms but in factories. Labor-intensive manufacturing would absorb surplus labor, which would be more productive on the shop floor and get paid more. If fewer hands were employed on the farms, incomes per head would rise for those who stay engaged in agriculture, and farmers would be less worried about assured prices, he writes. Can India and the US convert their transactional defense relations to strategic one? Asks Ajay Shukla in his column in Business Standard. When Mr. Modi congratulates America's next president on his inauguration, the Indian leader must begin locking the US into a relationship that yields strategic benefits for India, he writes. PM Modi should remind Joe Biden that America's goal of expanding multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific includes a pivotal role for militarily powerful India. In 2 months from now, Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present the budget for 2021-22. This will be her third budget and much more challenging than her previous two exercises in July 2019 and February 2020, writes A.K. Bhattacharya. Even though the Indian economy is expected to notch up a record rate of growth next year, the challenges for her in the budget will only get more formidable. He suggests a three-pronged strategy to deal with these challenges. The budget should prepare a credible plan for restoring the government's fiscal health within a predetermined timeframe, help address concerns about tax buoyancy, and widen the reach and increase the rates of non-tax levies to augment the government's revenues from areas that so far have been ignored. The march of farmers to Delhi to protest the farm reform laws requires deft political management of the situation, says Business Standard in an editorial this week. The government must explain its stand better to the farmers and not make things like the protest venue a factor in engaging with them. The editorial states that the fact is that current forms of price support distort the market, cause overproduction of certain food grains, are regionally imbalanced, and are environmentally and otherwise harmful. In this case, the solution to farmers' concerns about existing reforms is more reform, concludes the editorial. In his weekly column, Mahesh Vyas takes a look at data related to GDP growth and employment in India. In the June 2020 quarter, when the real GDP contracted 29.3% over the previous quarter, employment contracted by 21%. However, employment expanded by 23.2% in Q2 compared to Q1. This is the result of movement of labor from factories to farms, he writes. Although the economy recovered substantially in the September 2020 quarter, the reverse migration from factories to farms did not stop during this quarter. Given the low labor productivity in agriculture in India currently, it is imperative that labor is rechannelized into factories, offices, and markets, he writes. Some people think that the government will run the COVID-19 vaccination program. Reality may be a little different, writes Ajay Shah in his column. Policymakers need to choose between three paths, he writes. The first path consists of tendering private firms to supply vaccination services for civil servants and building state capacity for public goods of the health statistical system. The second path consists of trying to find a centrally planned vaccine rollout for the people, but retaining the humility and not interfering with the working of the private market. The third path consists of using the coercive power of the state to interfere in the private market. A Business Standard editorial on the Q2 GDP figures released late last week says that Q2 figures look encouraging, but the outlook for the economy still remains fairly uncertain. At a broader level, even though the headline growth numbers would show an improvement in the coming quarters, in absolute terms, the economy would regain its pre-pandemic size perhaps only towards the end of the next fiscal year. It will be a long road to recovery, and the medium-term outlook remains fairly uncertain. The Union government has issued guidelines for motor vehicle aggregators like Uber and Ola under the Motor Vehicles Amendment Act of 2019. The guidelines are meddlesome and will leave riders, consumers, and businesses all worse off, says Business Standard in an editorial this week. The regulations are ill-conceived and poorly drafted. The broader point is that the government should have more hesitation in wading into complex and still developing markets with blunt force regulations that will do more harm than good, it says. Union Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal on Wednesday reaffirmed the government's commitment to an ambitious export target of $1 trillion by 2025. Given the current state of private investment in India alongside the shadow over the world economy, this much is a tall order, says Business Standard in an editorial. Given the policy context, most observers would assume that no real attempt to raise exports sustainably is in fact being made. If anything, the government has shifted into a protectionist import substitution mode, says the editorial.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.